sustainability, and a zero waste policy. This is why we create innovative solutions that support a climate-conscious economic development in Africa. This starts with neutralizing carbon emissions and creating a positive environmental legacy. By 2022, all of Arise IIP's industrial zones will be carbon neutral, powered fully by solar technology. This is all made possible by the dedication and commitment of the women and men who work at Arise. Together, we are on a journey to build an African industry, a journey to create a better, more resilient, sustainable, and inclusive future for everyone. Arise IIP, committed to making Africa thrive.
Ernest, I cannot hear you. Jim, can you hear me?
Indeed I can, Kason. How are you?
Good. I'm doing very well. Thank you so much. I think I couldn't hear Ernest.
No, nor can I. So let's give him a chance to catch up with us. Good morning, everyone. Just please bear with us for a few minutes.
Can I just...
Hi, Jim. You can't hear Ernest. Can you take the lead?
Good morning, everyone, and we apologize for the technical glitches. Welcome to another session of the ACA Global Market Encounter with Jim Fitzpatrick. I would like to appreciate our sponsors and partners who have made it possible for us to bring this session to you. Please note that this session is being held in English with a simultaneous French interpretation. To access it, click on the globe icon on your screen, select a preferred language, and mute the original sound. James, since you're already on, please go ahead with the session. Thank you.
Morning, Blessing. Thanks very much indeed. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. It's good to be with you again. Let's have a look at what we're going to talk about today. So we'll do our usual format, actually. We'll start with the discussion of the current market. We'll talk a little bit, focus on supply and demand. And to do that, we have one of the nicest guys in this business that I know, Case Blockland, is going to help us to talk about supply and demand. Case has many years experience, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that shortly. Okay, so let's have a look at some of these indicators. So as the year goes on, I'm going back to the old format. We'll have a look at crops, we'll have a look at inventories, we'll have a look at prices, and we'll have a look at demand. First of all, Southern Hemisphere crops. indications are that East African crops are a little bit lower than hoped for. The Brazilian crop, again, a little bit lower than hoped for, although a little bit better than last year. And in Indonesia, pretty much the same as we've seen before. So in all the arrows, red is for down, blue is for up, and orange is for no change. If we look at inventories, and now we're talking mostly about RCN inventories, I think we've seen an increase over the past couple of weeks in the available RCN in Vietnam. As product is arriving, transit stocks are building up, exports a little bit flat compared to last year. In India, and again in West Africa, really no change. There are some balances left in parts of West Africa, but I think a lot of it is already committed. And if it's not already committed, I'm pretty sure it'll go to India fairly soon. So looking at the kernels trade, and this has been a real question mark over the past 3, almost 4 months now. And what we've seen is that there has been a little bit of a pickup in the trade, both in India and in Europe, particularly in India, and in the US and in China, although the US is by far the more important of the two. We've seen continued decline in imports, relatively low traded volumes, and there's certainly some problems, and we'll come back to that shortly. Looking at prices, yeah, we have seen a pickup in prices in Vietnam. The market is off the recent lows for the time being anyway. It's been a very predictable situation that it would come back. But again, we never expected it to go to some of those low prices that we talked about last time. Anything can happen. But it does look as if prices have picked up a little bit. In India, in Brazil, prices relatively steady. So when we look at the situation overall, we could probably say that there are higher than normal inventories in Vietnam. Maybe also we could say the same of Guinea-Bissau, possibly Senegal. It looks as if the inventories of kernels in the major Western markets are being worked through. And there's also an indication here, though, that in some of the markets where there has been, let's say, intervention to manage the market, and I'm talking RCN now, where there's been intervention to manage the market through various systems, warehouse receipt systems, stock and sell systems, that there's some indication that some of these have backfired again, and that people have ended up with stocks that they really shouldn't have as we get towards the end of the year. Okay, so we're going to have a look at each of these 4 areas, and we'll start off by having a look at the crops and the news on the crops. Well, the biggest producer at this time of year is, of course, Tanzania. And last time out, we had the Cashew Board of Tanzania with us. And I just wanted to have a look again at what's happened in terms of the chat, at least on the size of the Tanzanian crop. First thing is, I think that those early estimates around 400,000 tons, which are now revised downwards, this was never likely to happen this year. The weather is being pointed to as the issue, and whereas it's quite possible to see 5 years, 6 years from now, it's quite possible to see Tanzania produce 500,000 tons. I don't think 400,000 was ever on this year, but it is growing. This year may be the exception. Auction sales have been a little bit slow. Auction prices have been, it's ex-warehouse, so around about $750. Sales made now between $780 and $830 ex-warehouse. But don't forget, before you get excited at these low prices, don't forget those are ex-warehouse. You've got a FOB, you've got to insure, you've got to freight, you've got to pay $160 of export taxes. You've got to finance it, and you've got to get it where it's needed and where it's going to be processed. So it's not as cheap as it looks. I think value is probably somewhere in the region of $1,350 a ton. Maybe it needs to be a little higher than that actually to make trade happen. How is the auction going? Well, I just compiled this very quickly for you. And the yellow bars represent where we were last year at each of these dates, 8th of October, 15th, 30th, 12th, 26th. The numbers at the top are the quantity that was sold at auction on each by each of those dates. So it's cumulative. And you can see the red bars, 2022, and we are way behind. So there's two things going on there. One is that the crop is a little bit later. Secondly, allied to that, actually, farmers were a little bit reluctant to accept some of the prices that were initially offered. But the board has been explaining the situation, and recent prices seem to be much more connected to the real value of the raw material, which unfortunately still goes to India and a smaller amount to Vietnam for processing. Looking at that, you would expect that there is going to be an effort to move product, but I'm not sure whether or not this demand is going to be there in the immediate future for that. We might have a longer auction season than normal. Moving to Brazil and the current estimates. So in Brazil, there are official estimates, so government estimates of the crop. And we're looking at this year around about 122,000 tons, which is up on last year, but not as high as 2020, 2019, 2018. So as if we didn't already know it, Brazil is going to be stuck in this position around about this volume, maybe a little more. In a bad year, maybe a little bit less, but there's not going to be any great change in that. What's interesting is that exports continue. Exports have been around about the same volume for the past 8-9 years or so. There's no sign of a change in that. But the domestic market has evolved, and domestic consumption in Brazil is increasing, which is quite interesting, actually. Even the consumption in neighboring countries in Latin America has also been increasing. If you look at where the Brazilian exports go, still mostly to the US market, but now more and more to the European Union. So this is becoming interesting. And if we look at the place of Brazil in the world market for kernels now, it's become a high quality, high food safety ingredients supplier. Very reliable suppliers, not too many of them left, but very reliable suppliers of high quality, excellent food safety practices, and it's evolved into a premium market. It's closer to markets in North America, its target markets, North America, Europe, certain amount to the Middle East. But it is quite interesting to look at this and see how Brazil as a supplier has changed. So Brazil today is producing less than Mozambique. Let's have a look at Mozambique. So Mozambique this season, and again, we had the Cashew Institute of Mozambique with us last time, and they gave us a pretty good presentation on what's happening. I extracted a few thoughts from it just to discuss it again this week and to have a look at it. So the forecast is around about 150,000 tons. The reference price is down. The reference price is down from 43 to 37, about 14% down, but that's pretty much in line with the market. There are now, as I've heard in the last couple of weeks, some concerns emerging regarding the size of the crop, mostly related to weather during the growing season. So you have two kind of differing opinions on this at the moment. You have the official reports, which we probably should consider as the most accurate for now, but we also have some concerns emerging that the crop may not be as good as it was initially predicted. I think it's fair also to mention, and it was mentioned last time, but maybe not highlighted enough, that there has been huge work in Mozambique on the provision of seedlings, 5 million seedlings in the last 2 years, an increase of spraying and care for the trees. The figures are somewhere in the region of 8 million trees sprayed in 2022, to add to 7 million in 2021. So you would expect that that activity, the seedlings plus the better management of the trees, by my calculation over time should add or could add something like 45,000 tons of production to Mozambique, assuming all other things are equal. And it is worth having a look at Mozambique. Very interesting cashew producer, amongst the first in Africa in the current generation to get processing going. And we can see the history of the production, and it's based, again, these are official figures from the Institute, and we can see that production has been relatively stable in recent years, slowly rising. It is quite difficult, though, to explain how this works, because, and I've been looking at it this week and taken an opportunity to have a little bit of a study on the Mozambique cashew sector. And when we look at it, we see figures for processing about 30%, which is high by African standards, as you know. We see export of RCN accounting for about 34% of the crop. These are 2021-22 figures. But what's surprising, maybe it's not that surprising, but it is a fact, is that the informal sector and the product moved into Tanzania accounts for something like 17% of the crop. And there was also significant carryout in 2021-22. So I am struggling to reconcile the figures, I'll admit that. I'm struggling to recognize that if there is 46,900 tons processed, where'd it go? Because we're seeing exports of 7,281. Now, one of the things that maybe I feel is very significant is that 55% of the export of Mozambique cashew kernels went to Vietnam. Now, I'm assuming, and this was clarified for me by the Institute, that most of those are on-peel kernels. And that's not really good news. So it looks like processors have looked for a short-term solution to the difficulty of cost and move themselves from cashew kernels exporters to this interim product, unpeeled cashews. The other market that's significant is the European market. And surprisingly, the US market has faded away from Mozambique. It's a little bit disappointing. Certainly go back when I was beginning in this industry, and for many years afterwards, the US was a really important customer for Mozambique, and that seems to have dropped away, which is disappointing to see. So situation in Mozambique, definitely it's getting better. Certainly we can expect it to get better, but it looks to me as if processors are still struggling. It's a tough time for them, and it may be time for them to get a little bit more support from NGOs, from the government, wherever that might come, as is being done for many countries in West Africa. There is an opportunity for processing in Mozambique. There's a 60-year history, and it seems to me some support for that would be worth providing. So that's the crops in the three main countries. I should mention Kenya too. Kenya is a pretty small producer these days, somewhere in the region of 9,000 tons. And the outlook there is probably that the crop is a little bit less than hoped for too. So generally across East Africa, we're seeing crops a little bit less than hoped for, certainly less than originally expected. The worst seems to be Tanzania, but Mozambique, there's a question mark. No real problem that we know of, but there is a question mark there at the moment. So let's move on and look at our second factor. And we're talking about these four factors that we like to look at this time of year. That is Southern Hemisphere production, inventories, demand, and prices. So we'll move on and we'll have a look at inventories. And let's think about Vietnam first, probably the most volatile cashew country this year. And again, I've revised the figures that we normally do. So we look at opening stock, the crop. We have the actual export figures to the end of October. We have imports actually to the end of October. And we have a certain amount of transit stock, which is only an estimate, of course, because we can't know for certain what that is. But based on those calculations, it looks as if the available stock has dropped in the past 2 weeks, by calculation, of course, from 3.4 months to 2.9 months. But it's not a major issue, not by any means, because if you think about that, 3 months on brings us to the end of January. And the end of January, by then, the Chinese spring demand has been filled. Factories are closing for maintenance. The Cambodian crop is going to begin early in February, and the Vietnamese crop will follow. So it doesn't look at this moment that there are any major prospects of significant buying of raw cashew nuts in Vietnam. And even if there is, this transit stock you would expect to be the first product to go. Looking at exports and imports, both figures are down on 2021, but these figures need to be looked at a little bit more closely. So I wanted to look at imports. And we do read a lot about the imports into Vietnam and how much they've declined since last year. So let's have a look and just see if we can learn anything from the import figures. So first of all, the bars are the years from 2018 until the current year. So we're looking at the red bars, 2022 monthly imports, the green, 2021, and then each year behind that. First thing that grabs you when you look at this chart is that the red bars in October, September, and August are below not only 2021, but also for 2 of the months below the previous years, 2020, and much lower than 2019. But this needs some explanation. So first of all, we need to point out that the figures for imports during March and April in 2021 were hugely overstated. That's known. It's known in Vietnam. It's known in Cambodia. It's pretty clear. So first of all, we need to be very careful when we look and make comparisons between 2022 and 2021. More valid would be to look at the situation for 2020 and the situation for 2019. So looking at that, it seems to me that what we're seeing is simply the impact of imports from Cambodia. More and more imports from Cambodia. This year, it probably represents the reality, somewhere around about 700,000 tons. That's what they think in Cambodia. That's what the statistics now in Vietnam start to say. So we're definitely going to see a situation where demand from Vietnam arrives to the West African market later and is lower than it previously was. There still is huge demand, obviously, and we can see that even in this year's figures. But it's quite clear that there is an impact of Cambodia, and that's what we're seeing. But there's also an impact to a certain extent of maybe a certain amount of overbuying of RCN, a certain amount of panic in management of the kernels market, and we've talked about that before. So I think looking at this situation, I think probably the chances of major demand coming from Vietnam for either East African or remaining inventories of West African RCN are pretty slim at this stage. If they've got 3 months of stock, that takes them through to January. There may be a spike in exports, but it seems unlikely at this time of year. Moving on, let's have a look at India. So India is a really star market this year, record demand. You can see in the chart on the left-hand side, monthly imports for each of the 5 years. And I just draw your attention to the red bars. So this is India's imports by month in 2022. And you can see that it's absolutely breaking all records. If we look at the cumulative, so the blue bars represent 2022 month by month, cumulative. So it's going up every month because it's adding what happened over the previous months. And then compare that to, well, compared to any year you like. But looking at the 4 years in question, you can see that the cumulative imports now, estimated to the end of September by Indian Customs, show that all records just completely blown away. So record demand, huge recovery in Indian demand for cashew nuts. Some suppliers report that their sales are up by 30%. That's in the domestic market. I'm not saying that demand is up by 30%. I'm sure it's not. But there are anecdotes of certain suppliers reporting those kind of numbers. It does look as if the RCN stock, based on these import figures, is adequate for now. I know that according to reports that the stock of kernels is quite low. I think we will see continued buying. I think Indian buyers will be interested in Tanzanian raw cashew nuts, for example. I think that they will come to the market, but I don't anticipate that they will come in any aggressive, panic-stricken or pushing prices up kind of a style. I think they can take their time and manage their sourcing probably in a relatively conservative way. But this is big news. If India returns to this kind of demand growth for the long term, that means significant change in the makeup of the international cashew market. So let's come back to that a little bit later. So we're talking about demand, and we're talking now about the US market. So as you can see, similar US market, the red bars, 2022 imports, and what you see is a pretty good start to the year. Record January, record March, in between faded a little bit. Probably that's more about management of shipments. And then as the year has gone on, imports have fallen away. So it looks to me as if people built inventories in expectation of good demand, or possibly in expectation of disruption to shipments. Maybe there was an element of catching up on shipments which were late or delayed from 2021. And they've corrected that now. They've corrected that by importing less. So September is the lowest September that I can remember in terms of imports. It's 42% lower than last year. Overall, US imports are down this year by about 14.5%. I think that is probably a short-term factor, but it's certainly going to continue for October and November, because we know what's been shipped to the US from Vietnam. We have a pretty good idea what's been shipped from African countries, and we can predict, I think, that US imports will end the year somewhere around about 14% down on last year, maybe even a little bit more than that down on last year. But let's try and put some context on that, and let's have a look at a comparison overall. So again, we're looking at the cumulative figures. So they add up as the chart moves from right to left. The bars are 2022 and the lines are the 3 previous years. So what we see is that despite the imports this year being down 14.6% on last year, they are still matching 2019. So we may be looking here at a situation where 2020 and 21 were actually just heavily COVID related, especially in the early part of the year, and that what we're seeing now is a correction. I don't think there's any fundamental issue with demand for tree nuts in the US. I know that sales are significantly down at the moment, but you're looking at a series of factors: inflation, higher interest rates, certainly publicity around difficult economic circumstances emerging but not confirmed, and this may well have caused people to tighten their belts a little bit when they go shopping for certain items, and that looks like it. That would include tree nuts at this moment. So US imports for now in trouble. I do think lower prices impact the US market. I do think that lower prices, as we've seen for the past 9 months or so, are going to have a huge impact on demand in the US when we get into 2023. So let's have a look and ask this question, which is being asked by many of us: has the low price point passed? And we've looked at, last time and the time before that, we looked at some very low prices driven by middle-sized and smaller Vietnamese processors, hitting levels that ended up at 13-year lows. We have seen in the last couple of weeks, maybe a little bit longer than that, something of a recovery in prices, more buying interest, and maybe some reason to believe that we might have passed the low point. So let's have a look at our usual indicators. So these are the two prices in Vietnam, either end of the scale, and it's quite narrow at the moment. So the lower prices have moved up a little bit. The lower end shippers have moved up a little bit, and the top processors have perhaps just maintained their price levels. If we compare that to our averages, our 5-year averages and our 2-year averages, we see now that the market is a little bit above the lows of the 5 years and the 2 years. So we're now looking at maybe recovery. So one of the things in the business in most markets is that sentiment plays a big part. So if buyers feel that prices are beginning to move up, that tends to focus their attention, and they tend to start to look at making buying decisions. So let's have a look at some of the other factors. And firstly, if we look at the situation comparing dollar prices and euro prices over the past couple of years from January 2021. So what we're seeing now is that prices have moved up. The US dollar euro rate is off its low, and we're still looking at some of the lowest prices for many years, but it does look as if it is perhaps slightly better than it was. So I thought maybe a good way to look at this would be to look at the situation for Vietnamese. Obviously, Vietnamese exporters dominate the market, Vietnamese processors dominate the market. So let's have a look at their situation. We might just focus in on this chart a little bit. So this chart attempts to calculate cost for imported raw nuts, which is important at this time of year, and for the domestic raw nuts. So what we try to do is we take an index for imported raw nuts, we calculate that month by month, and then we look at the revenue. So we take into account the outturn yield for those imported nuts and the prices that can be made in the market. It's by no means a perfect analysis. Don't forget, most processors, bigger ones especially, sell forward. So they're not trading in the spot market. But this would be an indicator of the profitability if you buy RCN today, or if you bought RCN in any of these periods mentioned, and you sold kernels at the same time. What would your indicator be? And it still doesn't look great. It's a little bit better than it was, but it's still not profitable. So if we look at this period, March 22 to November 22, we're still seeing a very close match between the revenue that can be generated and the cost of the raw cashew nuts that are bought to make those kernels. What it leaves at the moment is about 14%. Now that 14% is to finance, manage, and make a profit. And it's not working clearly. So still we have this mismatch between the cost of raw cashew nuts and the kernels market, particularly for Vietnamese processors, particularly for mid and smaller processors. That is causing a reduction in the processed volumes, naturally enough. Why would you keep doing something which loses you money? And it's causing, therefore, a lack of demand for raw cashew nuts and a buildup of transit stock. The question is always, is the RCN overpriced, or are the kernels underpriced? You can answer that in many ways, but it's probably a little bit of both. Certainly, it's hard to make an argument that RCN is overpriced at the moment in terms of the history of the market. Prices are not at anywhere near high levels, what might be described as historical highs, even 1, 2 year, even 6-month highs. If we look at kernels, on the other hand, the market is certainly trading at very low levels compared to the history. So we have things to go on here. So we have the history, we have the current demand situation, we have the current supply situation. And looking at that, what you would tend to say is that it's probably that kernels are underpriced. So the answer to the question, has the low price point passed, is probably yes, but with a certain amount of caution, because it can be influenced by very few export processors who may again come under pressure. As kernels buyers come to the market, and they do have to come to the market at a certain point, the time for waiting is probably past now. They need to ease themselves a little bit more into the market. The prices are not in any way prohibitive, certainly for buyers who are selling in dollars, so for American buyers in particular. Maybe for European buyers, it's a little bit more complex. And we'll come to that, and we'll get a chance to talk to Case about that in a few minutes. So overall, I'm saying, yeah, I think probably the low point of the market has passed for 2022, 2023, but be cautious, and I wouldn't, it's certainly not a time for speculation in the market. But what I wanted to do was have a look at demand, bigger picture, stand back from it a little bit, and try and let's see if we can look at the long term. I'd mentioned we'd do this last time. So we put together some numbers. And what we did was we took production. So on the left-hand side of these bars, you've got production. You've got RCN tons here. And here's production 2021 and a projection for production 2030. There's a lot of numbers behind this, but let's just keep the chart simple. And what we're seeing is that when we look at production, so what I did was I said, okay, what would happen if every African country achieved its target? So if Benin produced 500,000 tons, if Tanzania produced 500,000 tons, if Cote d'Ivoire maintained and steadily grew, and so on. What would happen if that happened? And less likely, I think, that Cambodia reached 1 million tons of production. And that would bring us up to about 5.5 million tons of production. We took certain factors into account here, factors like the aging trees in some countries, the infrastructure in some countries, and maybe some overestimates of the targets. But in general, I think what we've got is a pretty optimistic forecast. Then we said, all right, let's have a look at demand. So we looked at demand, and the blue bar is an estimate of demand in 2021. And you can see that supply and demand relatively closely matched. It's a funny thing, isn't it, that when supply and demand is closely matched in cashews, the market can still be very volatile. Close match of supply and demand, prices can still crash. And it can go the other way, as happened in 2017. So then we said, all right, let's look at some of the projections for demand. So we took 3 different factors. The first factor we took is, what if demand grew at the same rate between 2021 and 2030 as it had done in the 10 years up to 2021? And incredibly, that's what you get. This figure up here is heading up toward 6.8, 6.9 million tons RCN basis. So cashews have been growing quickly. Is that likely to continue? Probably not. You don't get sort of 2 booms following on from each other, and certainly not given that demand would exceed supply. So we stepped back again and we said, okay, let's look at some of the estimates of the average demand growth for tree nuts. This is mostly American research, mostly done for exporters and trade organizations in California. And they're coming up with, again, pretty significant growth on tree nuts. I think the forecasts are all around 4 to 4.6% growth. And if you apply that to cashews 2021, this is what you get in the yellow bar. If you went for the most optimistic, and this is by an outfit called Future Market Insights, And Future Market Insights is a consulting and research company that has come up with a remarkably positive forecast for consumption of tree nuts over the next 10 years. This is what you would get. You get demand up somewhere around about 8.5 million tons. This is highly unlikely to happen, I think. It may happen for certain tree nuts, but I don't think it's going to happen for cashews. But the message I wanted to place with you is, even though we looking at September, October, November 2022 as quite negative in demand, particularly the US market, but also in Europe, probably everywhere with the exception of India. If we look at any of the measures, any of the forecasts over the next 9 years, we are looking at significant growth in demand. And it doesn't matter which measure you take. It's not a case of one says it's going up and one says it's going down. Every single measure that you can find says that demand is rising. It's just a question of by how much. So I thought that was a kind of an optimistic note to finish that section on. And what we'll do is let's go and talk to our guest, who knows quite a little bit about demand and about cashews, Kees Blokland. So Kees is from Nuts2, where he is a director. He's an INC ambassador, and he's a board member of the Netherlands Nuts and Dried Fruit Association. Kees is, as I said, he's one of the nicest guys you'll meet in our business. He's got many years' experience of all kinds of tree nuts, not just cashews. And we're going to have a little bit of a discussion about the European market, and we're looking forward to hearing his views. So, Kees, are you with us?
But the host has to start a video. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now. How are you?
Good. I'm doing very well. Thank you so much. And thanks for the nice words, Jim. I highly appreciate.
You're very welcome. Can we have Kees's video, please? Okay, I think
yeah, let's just start.
I think we should. We want to see you, Kees. Come on.
There I am. Yeah.
You're looking well.
Yeah, thanks.
So what I wanted to talk to you about, we've been talking about demand and we've been talking about long-term and short-term problems. What's your take on it? How are you seeing demand, especially in the European market? How are you seeing inventories? What's your general impression of the current situation and indeed the longer-term situation?
Yeah, thanks for that. And I have to say, I thank you as well for the very positive notes on future, which I completely share with you and I agree with. When we are looking at today's situation, it's just looks negative. And yes, we are in challenging times, but that's the whole world. And in our opinion, the main reason for that is that we are coming out of COVID. So people spend money on traveling, going out, instead of bringing luxury products home. I think that the inventories which were built up and which are still around for all kind of tree nuts are also caused by the logistic issues we have had in 2021. So that people said we want to make sure that during the holiday season we have stocks. And then because of the high inflation numbers, we see that consumption figures are down a little bit. I mean, they are contradictory. It's depending a little bit to whom you're talking to. When I'm talking about the European market, it's less than the US market. So consumption, yes, is down, but how much it will be towards the end of the year, it's a bit hard to say, but it will most probably somewhere between 5 and 10%. When we are talking about the US, you mentioned the number of 14%. And yesterday I spoke with quite a big importer in the US market who was saying, yeah, my sales are according to budget. So more or less in line what we expected,
yeah,
and not in particular that they were down. So it's a little bit depending whom you talk to. It also looks like that the consumer is more going to the discount market and to the private labels than they're going to the A labels. So the people who have their own brands seems to be hit more than the private labels. So that is having a bit of that's having an impact. But overall, we share with you the positive idea that looking long term, we are convinced that the growth figures will come back again, because the health claims we have on nuts, the problems we will have with meat supply, for example, and the new opportunities which are coming around, like cashew cheese, cashew milk, cashew butter, all kind of stuff like that, will have the positive impact overall.
It's really interesting, isn't it, that we see so many different views on this. I mean, the US market is interesting. I spoke to, the stats say imports are down 14% or so. I spoke to one private label packer in the States, and he told me his demand was down by 25%.
Yeah.
So it's very, very difficult to get an overall grasp on this. And I don't think we'll really see, maybe till January is when we'll see actually how the situation has evolved. Case, what would be your impression? Sorry, go ahead.
I fully agree with you. And what you're also seeing, that prices looks like they are coming close to the bottom or are at the bottom. So it's our recommendation to our buyers to say, okay, cover your requirements for 23, because the chances that it will come down a couple of cents more are there. But I mean, when demand will pick up, it immediately can turn around. And it's our hope a little bit. And I mean, we only can tell you early 2023, but that demand during November and December, during the holiday seasons in the US and in Europe, that interest will pick up for nuts again, and that people will bring more luxury products home, saying the high inflation is keeping us home, but then we want to have some luxury products at home to consume. But you see that interest we see that interest is picking up for the first half of next year, which also shows to us that also the importers and the roasters were reluctant to cover forward, because they were unsure about what consumer demand would do. And it's a bit of our concern, is probably too big of a word, but that the importers and roasters are not buying, that demand during the last 2 months will be good, and that all the demands from the roasters and the importers will show up during the second half of December. And when we will get it all at once, then we might have a jump in pricing, because just as you said, I mean, the availability of the RCN, it's more or less until the end of January. And when there comes pressure on that might push prices up.
Yeah, that certainly wouldn't be healthy. I mean,
nope.
I'd expect to see higher prices next year, but I'm hoping for a gradual rise rather than volatility in the market.
100%.
I mean, I agree with you. I agree with what you're saying. I think if I were buying cashews now, I would be covering at least a high proportion for the first half of next year.
Yeah.
There is always the concern that if you do get a jump in prices, that'll be followed by default of contracts, which causes another jump in prices, and that potential must be there for next year.
No, I fully agree with you. It's crucial that you buy from buyers you have a relationship with, because, as you said correctly, it's a volatile market, and although prices are low at the moment, I mean, that's even more. You need to be careful whom you're buying from, to make sure that when the market would rise, that you would get your contracts and that you will get the quality as you agreed upon.
Yeah.
And that's unfortunate, still happening in the cashew market. I mean, and I'm saying unfortunately, because that's not helping the market.
No, I think it overall impacts the health of the business, and it has a really negative impact on the launch of new products, particularly, I always think. And that's maybe one of the reasons why pieces get very volatile from time to time. Case, coming to African processing, I know that you, Nuts2, and your larger organization have been big supporters and developers of African processing going back 30 years, I think, maybe longer. How are you seeing those developments now? I mean, what do you think are the main factors that will drive the development of African cashew processing?
For us, when we look at the reports we are getting from our customers, then we are saying quality and commitment. Those are the crucial factors which you need to guarantee on the long term. When you are an African processor, make sure that you deliver according to the quality you agree upon, and that you commit to the contract you have in place, because that's that's what we were just discussing when we have cheap contracts in the books. And unfortunately, we have experienced that with Vietnam a couple of times, that when the market rises, then the quality of the product will become less. They will try to delay shipments, and you will have all kind of defaults sitting around. When you want to build a market, you have to make sure that you are reliable on everything you agree upon. And I think that the African industry is doing a great job when we look at quality. I think that the quality of the African cashew nut kernels, which are processed in Africa as well, because everybody knows that 60% coming out of Vietnam is probably slightly less now with Cambodia. But it's coming from Africa anyway. But the quality of the African processed cashew nut kernels, most of the times, are very well appreciated. Crispness, color, but I think it's crucial. Do what you are committing to, do what you are saying, and that's building a market, and not just on price. An advice to the African industry is as well, make sure that you have a market for all the products you process, because that's sometimes a bit of the problem when you talk to the African processors, that they're saying, yeah, okay, I can get rid of my 240s, 320s, but on my baby bits and on my small white pieces, that's getting a problem for me, or the off grades, or the second grades. I mean, make sure that you have a market, because that's something crucial in this one as well. If you can only sell 70% and make a profit, and 30% you have to sell at a loss, then it's not a sustainable business.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice. We're seeing new laws. We're seeing the German Supply Chain Act coming in January. We're seeing greater demand for traceability and sustainability from European buyers. How do you think that will impact African cashew processors?
That will definitely promote the African industry, and that will support the African industry in a big way. And I think, while one of the problems of the African cashew industry is that they have to finance their crop for the whole year round, which is make it sometimes a bit more expensive to finance that. I think the big advantage is that their traceability system, when we are, for example, talking about a factory from Burkina Faso, they're buying everything from Burkina Faso. They know the area where it's buying from. And that's becoming more and more important in the industry as well. What we are telling our customers as well is, look, it is traceable product. You are 100% sure where it's coming from. You can visit the factories, you can visit the farmer groups, you can have all the information you want. And I think that's becoming more and more important going into future, for sure.
Yeah, we're finding the same. We're finding that buyers, they want to be part of the story, and they want to understand where the product's coming from, who grows it, who processes it, the whole story. And that's got to be positive. I think you're absolutely right. That's really got to be positive for the African.
And we see, fortunately, especially in the European industry or in the European supermarket chain, you see a couple of examples where people are promoting specific origins. I mean, we have had it in the Scandinavian countries for Mozambique. We have it in Holland. We have it for Tanzania. We have it in the UK for Ivory Coast, which they are specifically saying the product is coming from that country, and that helps a lot. What we are advising our customers as well is, look, the quality from Africa is consistent. It's good, it's crispy, it's nice, it's white, and the industry has to prove himself into that. So they have to maintain that. I mean, when you're talking about the market in general, I mean, everybody is convinced about India. India is a premium product, and there are a lot of buyers who are willing to pay a premium for Indian product. And I mean, the African industry has to prove himself. When they do 10 years in a row, they delivered a nice product, then the market will be ready to pay a premium for that as well, because they say, okay, when we buy from Africa, the product is more consistent, not for us to clean, not to worry about foreign material, not to worry about whatever, and we get a consistent quality all the time.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing from you is advice to African processors: recognize that you probably can't compete on price, compete on quality,
100%.
Sustainability, traceability.
100%.
And that would actually play very much into the current trends in the market, maybe more in the European market than in the US market for now, but certainly that's where the market's going.
No, 100%. And what you mentioned in your presentation as well with regards to Brazil, I was surprised by the number of imports of Brazilian cashews into the European market. But as you correctly said, it's the premium quality. It's not to worry about, and the ingredient industry can put it immediately in the process. And I mean that's saving them a lot of cost and headaches. And that's the thing which the African industry has to differentiate itself from as well towards others. I mean, become reliable.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I was talking to at the CL Trade Fair, I was talking to Lilian Moura of Resibras. Marambaya is the brand, and she was telling me that they're selling batch ready ingredients.
Yeah.
And that's something that is possible from African factories.
It is.
So straight into the process, and that means a lot of confidence and trust on the part of the buyer that their supplier is able to do the job well.
Yeah, and that will not happen overnight. I mean, we have to admit that as well. I mean, that's something which you have to prove over a couple of years. So therefore, it's crucial, although it's difficult times every now and then, insist on your quality.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Regardless of the market price, insist on getting the quality right. Yeah. I was looking at, just to underline that, I was looking at a sample from a new cashew processor in Tanzania yesterday, and absolutely great cashews.
Yeah.
You know, great color, nice bold size, great taste. And that is quite possible. It was in Benin in August, same situation.
Yeah.
Cote d'Ivoire earlier in the year. So I'm really optimistic on quality from Africa, but I'm concerned that people may be tempted to cut corners when prices are low.
Yeah, and that they shouldn't do, because you will what's that verb? Penny wise, pound foolish.
Penny wise, pound
foolish. And that's
absolutely.
when you're looking on short term and long term.
Yeah, and I think that's I think the key advice that I was maybe hoping to hear from you. Think long term.
Yes.
And don't be this penny wise, pound foolish.
Yeah.
Kind of a guy, and I think that'll work.
Although I fully understand and admit as well that sometimes it's very difficult when you need the money now and not in the coming decade. I mean, then I know how hard it is, but then still, I mean, see what you can do, and otherwise discuss it with your customers and say, hey, what are we going to do?
Yeah, and I often think, and I don't know what you think about this, but I have a feeling that the current grading system is a little bit antiquated. I mean, it was designed back in the 1970s and 80s for a manual process. A lot has changed, and maybe we need to look at the whole grading structure.
Yeah,
because we've two problems. One is that you're certainly producing 36 grades of cashew kernels makes life very complicated for everyone. But secondly, we've seen, let's say overall, we've seen a decline in the quality of the cashew nuts available in supermarkets all over the world, maybe with the exception of India, over the last 20 years.
Yeah.
And a lot of people may not actually know what a really good cashew nut looks like.
Yeah.
And there's an opportunity in that, of course.
No, 100%.
Case, it's really interesting to hear from you. Let's go back to, I don't know if it'll be Blessing or Ernest, and see if they've got any questions for us. Ernest.
Yeah, thank you very much. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Good to hear you.
Oh, okay, very good. Pleasure seeing you again, Keith, and also Jim. And thank you for the updates, and also for the concise inputs for processing in Africa coming from Keith. There are a number of questions, and I think you can also jump in, Keith, if there is some input that you want to make any of the questions. But then it's mainly also on the presentations by Jim. And the first, there's somebody here who's asking what would be the possible producer price margin of nuts in West Africa. But let me bracket it and take another question online, which will also put that in perspective. There is a questioner who wants to know whether there are any reasons for the poor auction in Tanzania, and again, how are these likely to impact prices in West Africa, especially with the stocks remaining in Guinea-Bissau and Senegal. So the person is talking about poor auction sales in Tanzania, stocks still remaining in Guinea-Bissau and Senegal. And the point is that how will this affect the West African crop and prices, given that the season is just around the corner? Jim.
So that, wow, there you go.
Good luck, Jim.
That's about 17 questions in one. All right, let me
exactly. Good.
Thanks, Ernest. Always reliable. Let me. Okay, so the auction. First of all, I think that the auction is down to two things. First of all, the fact that buyers are relatively well stocked. They have had a situation where they've been able to buy in West Africa. Vietnamese buyers have been able to buy in Cambodia. And what we're seeing is an impact of the arrival of Cambodia into the market. So just as buyers come later to West Africa nowadays, because of Cambodia, they are likely to come later in East Africa too. So that's one factor. Secondly, I think that the farmers, we know farmers were reluctant to accept some of the bid prices. I understand that. I can see why that might be. But at the same time, I think that the prices that have traded for relatively low volumes are reasonable compared to the market. And I know that the Cashew Board has been doing some work to talk to farmers and to get that message across. This is one of the key things that we need to ensure. I know you, Ernest, and the African Cashew Alliance are doing a pretty good job on this, but we need to get more information out, more accurate information out, to allow people to have the tools to make decisions. Okay, how will this affect prices in West Africa? Well, first of all, let's think about it. Tanzanian auction is a premium product. It's generally a high-priced product. Most of it goes to India, and it's popular with Indian buyers due to its quality, its size, and its processing characteristics. If we look at the inventories in Guinea-Bissau, the small inventories in Senegal, those are a different target market. They are likely to find their way to the market. I mean, we should understand that this year in India, there will probably be something like 1.5, 1.6 million tons processed. If in Guinea-Bissau, there's 125, 130,000 tons available, it doesn't make a huge difference. I also think a lot of that material is committed. Now, if I were sitting there with a warehouse full of raw cashew nuts at this moment in time, unsold, I would be tempted to sell those, if I could. If I had them sold, obviously I wouldn't be worried. So I think most of it's committed one way and another. I think shipments have been a bit slow. Case mentioned it, we are seeing a long hangover from logistical disruptions. So I would say more than likely prices will not improve, but I don't think they will decline sharply either. So you could see $25, $50 movement, but I don't think you're going to see a sharp crash, particularly for high quality material and particularly for raw nuts that are suitable for export to India. So Senegalese material, Guinea-Bissau material, Tanzanian material will eventually find its way to India. So therefore, I don't think it's going to have a huge impact, but if anyone's sitting expecting higher prices for RCN, I think you should forget that idea for now. When the new crop comes around, I would expect that most of these inventories will be absorbed. I think you can expect a slow start to the new season, but we need to keep a close eye on what happens in Cambodia. We saw that last year the weather had an impact. We know that production in Cambodia has stopped growing. We know that farmers have, to a certain extent, turned to other products for new plantings. So we need to keep a close eye on that. So in short, I'm not overly concerned about the prospect of a sharp decline in raw cashew nut prices. I think it's a really difficult job for governments and regulators in determining minimum pricing in West Africa for the coming season. That's going to be a real challenge because you've got so many variables. Steady as she goes.
Keith, any additional thoughts on this?
No, I'm not involved in the ASEAN market, Ernest. I'm sorry about it.
Okay, very good. So the next question for Jim, has to do with India. Apparently, it's something interesting, very exciting going on there in terms of the growth in the Indian cumulative imports. And then it's even far in excess of the same period of the year, in excess of the other years, if you look at the statistics you presented. And the questioner wants to know what factors are contributing to this growth, which actually is showing widening growth over the last years.
A series of disappointing crops in India is one aspect. Slow growth in Indian production. There have been many efforts, but so far we have not seen an increase in Indian production, and that goes back 20 years. Relatively slow increase in production. There are some projects now. What we're seeing is post-COVID, a remarkable return of demand in India. And I think Case mentioned it earlier, and it's a good point that we shouldn't underestimate the hangover from COVID. There's a hangover there on logistics. There's a hangover represented by inflation. I mean, I know people talk about the war in Ukraine as the primary instigator, but don't forget, huge amounts of money were injected into economies in the last 2 years.
Yeah.
And that can impact inflation. And that too is a factor. And inflation was spoken about before the war in Ukraine happened anyway. And thirdly, just this positive trend in demand in India. So if we look at strong dollar, if we look at locally processed products, they become very attractive. Cashews is, the consumption of cashews is in the DNA of the Indian nut consumption. And when it grows, it's likely to return to very high levels. The question now is, can this level of growth be maintained going forward? If we look back at the history of it, we saw periods of very fast growth in demand in India. So we saw periods of 7% per annum growth going back a decade or so. If that continues, you're looking at adding, if India was to grow at 7% again for 10 years, India would require an additional 1.2 million tons of raw cashew nuts. We cannot increase production at that pace. And that's an important factor. And by the way, that factor is not focused, or not factored rather, into the numbers that I showed a little bit earlier.
Yeah.
Is it probably also, Jim, the growing middle class in India, so that more people have money to spend on cashews as well?
Absolutely. That's been a big driver over the years. It's been the, people with more money, then they get 2 years of, let's say, suspension of normal life, normal economic activity, and then they come back to the market.
Yeah.
And, why wouldn't they? Plus, don't forget, the healthy profile of this product is important in India, just as it is in countries in the West. It's important in China. These factors play out everywhere.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Jim and Keith. And from Facebook, a questioner wants to know if demand is dropping by 14% in the US, who is making the loss, especially if African processing levels have remained constant over the years, or particularly for the last 1 year. So indeed, if African processing has remained constant, who exactly is losing this 14%, which is the drop in demand from the US?
Well, I didn't say it was the drop in demand. That's the drop in imports.
Imports. Okay.
Imports, right? So that's the drop in imports. So the actual drop in demand might be more, or it might be less. And that depends on the inventory level going into the period. So we need to keep that in close perspective.
Yeah.
Where is that hurting? Probably mid and smaller Vietnamese processors are being hurt the most by this. They may be missing top-up orders, additional orders. As you know, most people buy their cashews on a forward basis, and then they come back to the market if they need any additional, maybe for promotions, maybe for additional demand, and that's not happening right now. So I think that's where the problem might be most expressed. That's not to say that African processors are, held free from that kind of problem, but I think it is more than likely impacting Vietnam more than African countries. Bear in mind, the primary marketing tool of the Vietnamese cashew sector for the last 20 years has been price. Our costs are lower, we're cheaper, we can meet your price. That's been the primary motivating factor. When you get into a position that prices generally are quite low, it's very difficult to generate new business based on price. So we see the situation now that a lot of African processors who have been, taking care to get their supply chain right and get their quality right, are able to make sales at premium prices compared to Vietnam, at a time when others are struggling. There are some where their inventories have built up a little bit. There are some niche markets where demand is slow, so it doesn't apply equally right across the sector. But I think what we will see as a result of this, and as a result of the kind of boom bust phenomenon that we've seen 2017 into 18, 19, 2020, 21 into 22, is a situation where we'll see a rationalization in Vietnamese cashew processing. And I think that the authorities of Vinacas and others in Vietnam realize that. And if you read some of the statements, they basically say that, and they're suggesting that the focus should be on higher levels of value addition, which ultimately makes a lot of sense. Although far more demanding in terms of quality. That's an issue that should be addressed too.
Anyway.
Yeah,
so,
and I think probably to add on to that, I fully agree with Jim that it's mainly with the Vietnamese processor at the moment, but it might have an impact unless something changes. It might have an impact on the next year's crop, on the 2023 crop, and then it might be that the farmers in Africa will play part of that as well. But once again, I mean, that's too early to say as that's still 5 months ahead of us.
Yeah, it's a good point though, Case. I think that's it's going to be a really challenging period. Government setting minimum prices, crops arriving February, March, maybe slow enough demand, particularly from Vietnam. How will early season prices work?
Yeah.
And we then definitely run into this issue of, if product is left lying in village warehouses or on farms, what will that do to quality, particularly in countries where the harvest period tends to involve a certain amount of rain? Could be a difficult start to next year. I think next year will be a good year, but I think it could be a really difficult start to the year.
I agree.
Two last questions, Jim, but this one is a bit convoluted, the first one. But it has to do more with the fact that outturns don't feature much in the volume discussions, and that the impression is that 1 million tons of RCN in Cambodia is far more than 1 million tons of RCN in Africa, if you are looking at the outturn. So how do outturn affect the dynamics of supply and demand and also prices in the global market? I think, let me just summarize it more in that way.
Okay. Yeah, okay. So it's true. I by the way, I mean, let's put that up again, but I'm not sure Cambodia will reach 1 million tons. I just want to underline that. I've put that in there because that's the big number that's spoken about. I'm not sure that will actually happen. Yes, it is true that if you have 1 million tons in Cambodia at an outturn of 50-51 compared to 1 million tons in parts of West Africa at outturns around 47, that it makes a difference, and that difference is reflected in the price of the RCN. There's no doubt about that. Quality should always be reflected. Unfortunately, to a large extent in the international raw cashew nut trade, at least in the export aspect of it, better quality doesn't always achieve higher prices. But we can work out the numbers. If you take an average 47 versus an average 51, you're looking at about 8% difference. Is that reflected in price? Partly. What's more reflected in price is for Cambodia, it's much cheaper to move that product to Vietnam to process. That's a big factor. It's much more controllable in terms of you can much more easily send people to have a look. You can much more easily set up a network of local agents. Having said that, Cambodia would also have its own ambitions in processing. It does have very high quality products. It would be difficult for Cambodian industries to compete with a very large and efficient Vietnamese industry next door, but they do have ambitions in that area. And so what's reflected in price is quality, distance to market, and now increasingly other factors like traceability, like sustainability. And I think more impact on raw nut prices in Africa will be the development of processing than differences in quality between different countries. Now, we have seen, notably in the exports RCN from Cote d'Ivoire in the last 5 years, we've seen many positive comments from processors in Asia with regard to improvements in quality. And that's to a large extent down to post-harvest. So I think, yes, it will have an impact, but that impact is already in the market. It's already in the structure of the market, but it's also something that can be addressed. And the simplest way to address it is to look after the post-harvest handling of the cashew nuts. That's, I think everybody knows that that's a really important element of getting quality right. And my argument is that local processors are far more likely to work with farmers or cooperatives or other farmer groups to improve quality, to work with development organizations and NGOs to deliver services to farmers than the export trade is. And the reward for that is now becoming apparent in better pricing for traceable, sustainable cashews. And ultimately, that will drive the value of raw cashew nuts at the farm gate. Perhaps not next year or the year after, but over the coming decade. So we, again, I suppose it's a really interesting question, but we have to distinguish between short-term factors, supply-demand balances, inventories, particular season, and the much longer-term trends in the market and the factors that will impact longer term. So there's a convoluted answer to a convoluted question, Ernest.
Exactly, yeah. Well, and now there's another question that here I think I may have to read it. It's on the Q&A feature. It says, as a West African processor, we are concerned about the current low sales prices of the kernels. And then he talks about, in fact, question 3 and 4 of quarter 3 and 4 of 2022. I think that's where his concern is. As you said, if we are passing the lowest price point now, at the end of the year, we can expect the sales price to increase gradually. This could result in higher or similar RCN prices for the new crop in Western Africa. With the current RCN price and low sales price of kernel, it is practically not viable to make profits. This is a West African processor talking. Due to, okay, I think the question is more, do you expect the RCN prices to drop a little as a result of the lower sales price of the kernel in quarter 3 and 4, although not sharply for the new crop? Or if not, it seems better for the sales price to increase later after the RCN is bought for the next year. So more or less, whether you expect at least some price drop as a result of the low sales price in the kernel for kernels in quarter 3 and quarter 4. Yeah.
Well, I suppose based on what we know right now, we would expect that farm gate prices in 2023 will be a little lower than farm gate prices in 2022. We're already seeing that in Tanzania. We're seeing it in Mozambique. So I think that that's likely to happen in West Africa too. I completely agree with the questioner that it would be much better if the improvement in kernels prices was in the second half of next year. Not that I'm encouraging speculation, but I think I'd rather see, for the good of the industry overall, I'd rather see a gradual increase in prices of kernels over the year. I think that there may well be some drop in RCN prices between now and new crop. I don't think that'll be significant, but it certainly is likely that the farm gate prices will be lower. Ideally, from a processor's point of view, you would ideally like to be in a position that come February, March, April, you're able to buy your cashew nuts at workable prices and that you can make forward sales to match the prices that you're purchasing, so that your business is about making money through processing and not through speculation. And this is the point Case made is very important in this, that if you want to do that, you need to have outlets for all of the grades that you make, including the pieces, the off color, all of those different grades. And it's important. I mean, we talked about this at the African Cashew Alliance conference in Abuja, but it's really important to get marketing right, because sometimes if you don't have a good marketing operation, good communication with your customers, it doesn't matter where the market price is. You can't make those sales that you need to make. And that, it means good marketing, building the trust of customers, becoming reliable for quality, offering those benefits of traceability and sustainability, so building a supply chain too. It's not just about judging price, when prices will be A or B or up or down. It's about approaching the business as a business in which you make money out of adding value, processing, building a supply chain, not a business that you make money because you just happen to buy in the right time and the price went up.
No, I only can 100% agree on that. Make it a long-term relationship. Be transparent. Tell them what you are doing. Show them what you are. Ask them the questions what the customer needs, and then work out a plan together. And then you will get a sustainable business, because long-term customers will appreciate that. If you have just your price buyers or your calendar buyers, I mean, that's becoming a different story, because they only buy on price, and that will always be you get it or you won't get it. And but get your customers whom you can build those relationships with.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that this is the key to sustaining long-term business. Processing is not like trading.
Nope. And
you need different management skills and a much more longer-term vision. So I think, Case, we come back to that same point again, don't we, really?
Yeah.
It's the long-term vision and sustaining yourself through difficult times.
Yeah.
And your defense, in my opinion, your defense against difficult times is good relationships with your customers.
100%.
Good relationships with your suppliers.
Yeah.
Ernest.
All right, yeah. So finally, the last question has to do on with quality. But then before that, I had a questioner from Tanzania, Lila, from Tanzania, who is saying, please, African cashew processors should look now to the local market in Africa or to the African shelves, and not to look to the shelves of Europe and USA. Any comments on that?
I would only promote that. I only would applaud it. I only would support it. Exactly. I mean, build a local market as well. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying focus only on the local market, but I think that there are a lot of products can be made of cashews, which are very healthy, which will help the people, and which will be good for yourself as well. So I mean, and it comes back to what we just said: build relationships and make sure that you will get rid of all the products you do. And I mean, when you have a market for 320s, build a market for your off grades. When you have a market for your off grades, then probably have a look if you can locally do something with the 320s. I mean, see what grades are more difficult and find a way for that.
All right. Thank you very much. There's a question, this is the last one actually, which also goes to you, Kees. What are the updates on the recent EU requirements, particularly the requirements on quality from Germany? And what are you as a buyer, kernel buyer, doing in that respect to support processors from whom you buy from to update them on these requirements? And again, are these requirements that you think can be easily addressed by the processors that you are buying from?
What is becoming crucial those days is BRC certification or GFSI certification. So your food safety certification needs to be in place. Just having a HACCP program is for most of the buyers not enough anymore, and that will a couple of buyers will just disappear when you're just saying, I only have an HESA program. Another one which is becoming more and more important is SMETA or SEDEX certification. I mean, you get more and more buyers who want to assure that also the social system is in place, that the personnel working for you are getting everything they need, etc., etc. And then the third one, which is in Germany becoming more important, as Jim was referring to, is your traceability. I mean, that's becoming by law that they want to know where it's coming from, where it's processed, etc., etc. And Germany is the first country, but the rest of Europe and the US will follow shortly. I'm 100% sure about it, as that's one of the keys for the coming 5 years probably.
Okay. Another one. Sorry, please. Suddenly there are a lot of questions coming in your direction. I just got two. I think it is good if you can confirm that NOS2 doesn't buy raw cashew nuts. I think earlier on you were stating that you don't deal more with the raw nut end. And so in terms of how prices will work in that direction, it wouldn't be. But then there's somebody on Facebook who is writing that you're buying raw nuts and should have addressed the question. So I think maybe you can clarify that for me, so that because it's on Facebook, it's why I want you to clarify it. Yeah. No,
we do buy some RCN as well, but not from Tanzania. So I need to be more specific in that. And we as most of you will know, we have a factory in Burkina Faso, we have a factory in Benin, and we are building a relationship with the farmer groups. And the RCN we are buying from those farmer groups, I mean, we prefer, and that's the goal we have, to process that all in our own factories, or at least in Africa. But sometimes you have a bit of surplus, and that's then what we sell internationally. But I mean, we want to avoid that, and we want to minimize that to the maximum.
Okay. And now this question is a bit too direct, but then the person wants to know, ask Keith if he bought our 1050 to 52, will he process in Africa, or will he export the RCN to India or Vietnam?
Yeah, and I'm honest, I'm very sorry about it. I cannot, and even if I would, I cannot tell you, because we have our sourcing department. I'm in the sales department, so I'm responsible for the sales of the kernels, and I'm not involved in the purchasing of the RCN. It's just that I know about it, what I just said, but I don't know about which count they buy, etc. I have to verify that with them, so I do not have that answer.
Yeah, good. Normally we wouldn't ask these questions, but because it's lying there on Facebook with also a much wider viewership, so we try to clarify it. Yes. So I think
I'm open to be transparent. I mean, that's what this industry should have. Act transparent, so that we are prepared for the long term together. And we are here for the African industry, and I'm not here just sitting for NUTS2 or for global trading. I'm sitting here for the whole industry.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much, Keith. There are no further questions here. And maybe before I hand over back to Jim for his outlook for the coming 2 weeks or coming fortnight, and also what to expect in his next edition, maybe if you can tell us what in your way also you see as the outlook for the coming periods, especially into the end of the next season here in West Africa and also globally. Keith, did you get that?
Sorry, I thought you were asking Jim, isn't it?
No, we're asking what, in your view, will be your concluding remarks. What is your outlook for the cashew industry in the coming months, more or less?
Yeah, it's quite a difficult question, because a lot will depend on the coming 6 to 8 weeks, what the consumer will do. And it can go two ways. Either the inflation is having such a big impact, and the negative atmosphere around. I mean, you hear about inflation, you hear about war, you hear about the energy crisis, you hear about so many things which are worrying people, that they probably will be impacted by that. I think that should turn around and we should become more positive. I mean, look how we are, what we have and what we can get. And yeah, there is a fair chance that people will consume more nuts in the coming 6 to 8 weeks, and that they will bring more luxury products home. But it's depending on one of those two. So my personal hope is that we will see more consumption, and there is a fair chance. because we normally see that when we are having higher inflation rates, that people are staying more at home and bringing luxury products home. Is that going to happen? It's an exceptional year. We never have had the situation where we're coming out of COVID, having a high inflation, having a war nearby. So what I fully agree with what Jim said earlier is that if I would be a cashew buyer, I would cover my requirements for 2023. If I would be a cashew seller, then I probably would be a little bit reluctant and say, okay, let's see a bit further what's going to happen before I make my sales, because there is a fair chance that prices will come up a little bit.
Okay, thank you very much, Keith. And thanks so much for the input from your end. And now back to you, Jim, in terms of what is the outlook for the coming months and also what to expect for the next fortnight.
Okay, well, the way I'm looking at it is I think that there is a chance that buyers will become more active in the market towards the end of the year. There's good reason for them to have a look at the market, and prices are attractive. I think that RCN demand will remain relatively calm. There's enough material around. There are some stocks in West Africa, and there are, of course, crops in Tanzania and Mozambique on the way. I think that to a certain extent, and this is a personal opinion, the fears of inflation and the fears of an escalation of the war in Ukraine are beginning to recede. I think business is adjusting to the reality. I think as time goes on, the impact on logistics of COVID is better and better dealt with. Now, you never know what happens in these situations, but that's my own feeling on it for now. You know, we're in a situation where probably the reality is far less damaging than what was feared earlier in the year. So the reality of inflation, it's not easy, but it's not the disaster that was feared. And we live in a world that's been somewhat traumatized by 2 years of a pandemic. So I'd be becoming a little bit positive on that. I think that we will see reduced processing in Vietnam. And I think as the year comes to an end, that many processors in West Africa will also process a little less than planned as the markets calm down. I think that Southern Hemisphere crops, we've seen a reduction in the estimates so far. I think we might see further reductions in those estimates as time goes on, and they might be slower to come to market, and they might be a little bit smaller than even we're talking about today. And finally, I think we need to keep a close eye on Cambodia and Vietnam in particular. So if we look at the weather patterns in Cambodia, they are fitting again with an impact of La Nina, which is impacting the world weather system for the third year in a row. It's not unprecedented, but it is highly unusual. And we are seeing floods and cool weather in Cambodia at the moment. And now we have to watch what happens in Cambodia as a major producer. So those are the things I think for the next 2 weeks and probably over the next 4 weeks that we look at. At the same time, I feel the outlook is optimistic. I think that we have gone through a period of rationalization, and I think we're on a way toward this time a really significant growth in processing in Africa. So to the next time, we're going to be with you again on the 23rd of November. The plan then is, as usual, to talk about the market. And I wanted to talk also about how things work in India and Vietnam, the Asian cashew giants, as I'm calling them. And we're going to talk a little bit about how those two markets work. And the reason I'd like to talk about them is that there are a lot of perceptions amongst ACA members, amongst stakeholders in African countries about India and Vietnam, which are just not borne out by the reality. And we're going to talk about that next week, and hopefully we'll get some interesting guests to help us do that. So for now, from me, I'd like to say thank you very much to everyone for attending. A special thanks to Cees Blokland of Nuts2 and Global Trading for his really great, measured and thoughtful contribution. Thank you for that, Cees.
You're welcome.
And let me thank all of our contributors who asked questions and our interpreters. So see you next time. Thanks very much again. Take care of yourself. Bye-bye.
Many thanks to you, Jim, and to Keith. And we also appreciate our participants until we meet with you again on the 23rd of November for the next edition of the Global Markets Encounter. It is thank you and bye-bye to you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Dans ce contexte actuel de crise sanitaire mondiale liée à la pandémie de la COVID-19, il s'avère fondamental de relever la participation des femmes dans tous les maillons de la production, d'encourager et de renforcer leur leadership et leur résilience pour favoriser leur autonomisation, surtout dans le domaine économique. TechnoServe Bénin et l'Agence territoriale de développement agricole Pôle 4 s'inscrivent activement dans cette dynamique. À cet effet, le 15 et 16 octobre 2020 s'est tenu dans la salle de conférence